Pregnant woman abandoned by her family. Dishonest sheriff takes in and raises her son until the weight of disgrace. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Redemption Valley in the summer of 1885. The heat shimmered off the wooden buildings like a mirage, and the air was thick with the scent of dried earth and horse sweat. In the modest two-story house at the end of Main Street, behind drawn curtains and locked doors, a family was tearing itself apart. "You've brought shame upon this house, Sarah." Thomas McKinnon's voice boomed through the cramped parlor, his weathered face red with rage and embarrassment. His calloused hands, stained from years of working the general store, trembled as he pointed an accusing finger at his 19-year-old daughter. Sarah McKinnon sat hunched in the corner chair, her hands protectively cradling her swollen belly. At 7 months pregnant, she could no longer hide what had become the town's whispered scandal. Her auburn hair hung in loose strands around her pale face, and her green eyes were swollen from days of crying. "Papa, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her mother's muffled sobs from the kitchen. "I never meant for this to happen. William promised he'd marry me, but when his father found out..." "William Patterson," Thomas spat, his boots hitting the wooden floor hard as he paced. "That boy's family owns half the county, and you thought they'd let their son marry a shopkeeper's daughter, especially one who..." He couldn't finish the sentence, his disgust too overwhelming. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear her mother Martha crying into her apron. The sound cut through her heart like a knife. Her mother had always been her closest confidant, but now even she couldn't look at her daughter without shame clouding her eyes. "The whole town knows, Sarah," Thomas continued, his voice growing colder. "Mrs. Henderson saw you at the doctor's office. The church ladies have been whispering for weeks. Do you understand what you've done to our reputation? To our business?" Sarah's hands tightened around her belly, feeling the baby kick as if responding to the tension in the room. "This is your grandchild, Papa. Your flesh and blood." "This is a bastard child," Thomas roared, causing Sarah to flinch. "And I won't have it living under my roof, bringing more shame to our family name." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual sounds of the busy street outside seemed to fade away. Sarah looked toward the kitchen, hoping her mother would intervene, would show some mercy, but Martha McKinnon remained silent, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "You have until tomorrow morning to leave," Thomas said finally, his voice now eerily calm. "Take what you can carry, but don't expect any money from me. You made your choice, now live with it." That night, Sarah lay in her childhood bed for the last time, staring at the ceiling she had looked up at for 19 years. The baby moved restlessly inside her, and she whispered softly, "I'm scared too, little one, but I promise you, no matter what happens, I'll protect you." The next morning, as the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah McKinnon walked out of her family home, carrying a small satchel and wearing the only dress that still fit her growing body. Her father stood at the window, his jaw set in stubborn determination, while her mother wept silently in the kitchen, too broken to even say goodbye. As Sarah walked down Main Street, she felt the weight of curious and judgmental stares from the early morning shopkeepers and passers-by. Some whispered behind their hands, others simply looked away in embarrassment. The town that had once felt like home now felt like a prison of shame and rejection. With nowhere to go and no money to her name, Sarah found herself at the edge of town, sitting on a fallen log near the creek where she used to play as a child. The water gurgled peacefully, indifferent to her desperation. She placed both hands on her belly and felt the strong, steady movements of her unborn child. "What are we going to do, little one?" she whispered to the baby, her voice carried away by the gentle Texas breeze. "How are we going to survive this?" As the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, Sarah realized that her old life was truly over. Whatever came next, she would face it alone, with nothing but the love for her unborn child to guide her through the uncertain road ahead. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up, and she saw a lone rider approaching from the direction of town. Her heart sank, wondering if it was someone coming to drive her even further away from the only home she had ever known. The sheriff's burden, Sheriff Jacob "Jake" Morrison, had been riding hard for 3 days, chasing down a group of cattle rustlers who had been terrorizing the ranches north of Redemption Valley. At 42, he was a man worn down by years of compromise and moral flexibility. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his brown eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much and done things that kept him awake at night. The badge on his chest felt heavier with each passing year. What had started as a desire to serve justice had slowly transformed into a web of corruption and dirty dealings with the town's most powerful families. The Patterson family, in particular, had their hooks deep in him, and Jake had learned to look the other way when their money talked louder than his conscience. As he rode back into town, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust in the late afternoon heat, Jake spotted a figure sitting by the creek. Even from a distance, he recognized Sarah McKinnon. The whole town had been buzzing about the shopkeeper's daughter and her condition. Jake had heard Thomas McKinnon's loud proclamations about disowning his daughter, had seen the way the church ladies clucked their tongues and shook their heads in disapproval. Jake pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, his spurs jingling as he approached the young woman. Sarah looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, her face sunburned and streaked with tears. "Miss McKinnon," Jake said, tipping his hat. "Mighty hot day to be sitting out here in the sun." Sarah straightened her shoulders, trying to maintain some dignity despite her desperate circumstances. "Sheriff Morrison, I was just taking some air." Jake's experienced eye took in her small satchel, her wrinkled dress, and the exhaustion written across her features. "Your father throw you out?" he asked bluntly. Sarah's composure cracked, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I brought shame to the family name," she whispered. "Papa said I had to leave." Jake felt an unexpected stab of sympathy. He had no love for Thomas McKinnon, who had always been a self-righteous, penny-pinching man more concerned with appearances than compassion. But seeing Sarah in this state, alone and vulnerable, stirred something in Jake's chest that he thought had died years ago. "Where are you planning to go?" he asked, though he suspected she had no plan at all. I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice barely audible. "I have no money, no family who'll take me in. I thought maybe I could find work somewhere, but..." She gestured helplessly at her pregnant belly. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing. He thought about his own empty house on the outskirts of town, the place where he lived alone with his guilt and his whiskey. He thought about his late wife, Margaret, who had died in childbirth 5 years ago, taking their unborn son with her. The tragedy had been the beginning of his moral decline, the moment when he stopped caring about right and wrong and started caring only about numbing the pain. "You can't stay out here," Jake said finally. "Sun will kill you by morning, and there's coyotes and worse things that come out at night." Sarah looked up at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't have anywhere else to go, Sheriff." Jake made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I got a spare room at my place. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and walls. You can stay there until you figure out what to do next." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Sheriff, I couldn't impose." "You ain't imposing," Jake interrupted. "I'm offering. Take it or leave it, but decide quick. I got other business to attend to." As Sarah struggled to her feet, Jake helped her up, feeling the weight of her exhaustion and desperation. He loaded her small satchel onto his horse and helped her mount behind him. As they rode toward his house, Jake wondered what he was getting himself into. He had spent years avoiding emotional attachments, keeping people at arm's length, but something about Sarah's situation called to the part of him that remembered what it felt like to care about someone other than himself. His house sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, a modest 2-bedroom structure that had once been filled with dreams of a family. Now it was just a place to sleep off the whiskey and count the money he earned from his various corrupt dealings. "It ain't much," Jake said as he helped Sarah down from the horse, "but it's clean and quiet." Sarah looked around the sparse interior, taking in the bare walls and minimal furniture. To her, it looked like a palace compared to sleeping under the stars. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said quietly. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Jake busied himself with lighting the oil lamps, avoiding her grateful gaze. "Don't mention it, literally. I got a reputation to maintain in this town, and it don't include harboring, well, you know." As the evening wore on, Jake found himself watching Sarah move around the small kitchen, preparing a simple meal from the few provisions he had on hand. There was something peaceful about having another person in the house, something that made the shadows seem less oppressive. "Sheriff," Sarah said as they sat down to eat, "why are you helping me? Most people in town have already judged me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, poking at his food with his fork. "Maybe I'm tired of being like most people," he said finally. "Maybe I'm tired of a lot of things." As night fell over Redemption Valley, 2 broken souls found themselves under the same roof, each carrying burdens that had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Neither of them could have predicted that this chance encounter would lead to a bond that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, redemption, and the price of secrets. The birth of deception. 3 months later, on a cold October night in 1885, Sarah McKinnon went into labor. The wind howled outside Jake's house, rattling the windows and driving dust against the walls. Jake paced nervously in the main room while Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the town's only physician, attended to Sarah in the bedroom. Dr. Hayes was a stern woman in her 50s who had seen enough of life to pass judgment on very little. She had been the only person willing to treat Sarah during her pregnancy, much to the disapproval of the town's more respectable citizens. "Sheriff Morrison," Dr. Hayes called out, her voice cutting through Sarah's cries of pain. "I need hot water and clean towels. This baby's coming fast." Jake's hands shook as he heated water on the stove. In all his years as a lawman, he had faced down armed criminals and violent drunks, but the sounds coming from the bedroom filled him with a terror he had never experienced. He thought about Margaret, about the night she had died trying to bring their son into the world. The memory made his chest tighten with old grief. "Please, God," he whispered, a prayer from a man who had stopped believing in divine mercy years ago. "Don't let her die." Not like Margaret. Hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. Sarah's screams echoed through the small house, and Jake found himself drinking straight from a bottle of whiskey, trying to steady his nerves. Just before dawn, the cries suddenly stopped, replaced by the sound of a baby's first wails. "It's a boy," Dr. Hayes announced, her voice filled with relief. "A healthy, strong boy." Jake rushed to the bedroom door, his heart pounding. Sarah lay exhausted on the bed, her hair soaked with sweat, but she was alive. In her arms, she held a small, red-faced baby who was announcing his arrival to the world with impressive lung power. "He's beautiful," Jake breathed, stepping closer to get a better look at the infant. Sarah looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Would you like to hold him, Sheriff?" Jake's hands trembled as he carefully took the baby from Sarah's arms. The tiny boy was so small, so fragile, yet he gripped Jake's finger with surprising strength. Looking down at the child, Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct he thought had died with his own unborn son. "What are you going to name him?" Jake asked softly. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying the baby's face. "I was thinking, maybe Samuel, after my grandfather. He was the only one in the family who ever stood up for what was right." "Samuel," Jake repeated, testing the name. "That's a strong name." Dr. Hayes packed up her instruments, her expression serious. "Sarah, you need to rest for several days. This birth took a lot out of you, and you need to decide what you're going to do about the future. A woman alone with a baby, it's not going to be easy." After Dr. Hayes left, Jake sat by Sarah's bedside, still holding little Samuel. The baby had fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Sarah admitted, her voice weak with exhaustion. "I have no money, no family, no way to support him. Maybe I should give him to a family who can provide for him properly." Jake looked down at the sleeping infant, then back at Sarah. An idea was forming in his mind, crazy and complicated, but it might be the solution to both their problems. "What if," Jake began, then stopped himself. "No, it's too much to ask." "What is it, Sheriff? Please tell me." Jake took a deep breath. "What if we told people the baby was mine? That you were my wife and you died in childbirth?" Sarah stared at him in shock. "Sheriff, I don't understand." "Think about it," Jake said, his voice growing more confident as the plan took shape. "The town already thinks you're a fallen woman. If you just disappear, they'll assume you died somewhere or moved on. But if I claim the baby as my own, he'll have a name, a home, a future. I can provide for him, give him everything he needs." "But what about me?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake was quiet for a long moment. "You could go somewhere else. Start over. I'd give you money, help you get established in another town where nobody knows your story. You could have a fresh start." Sarah looked at her newborn son, her heart breaking at the thought of leaving him. But she also knew that Jake was right. She had no way to provide for Samuel, no way to give him the life he deserved. If she stayed, they would both be outcasts, struggling to survive on the margins of society. "You would do that for him?" she asked. "Raise him as your own son?" Jake nodded, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I would. I'll teach him to be a good man, to stand up for what's right. I'll give him opportunities I never had." Sarah closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "It would kill me to leave him, but maybe it's the only way to give him a real chance." They spent the rest of the day working out the details of their deception. Jake would tell people that he had married Sarah in secret, that she had died giving birth to their son. Sarah would recover for a few more days, then leave town under cover of darkness, taking on a new identity in a distant city. 3 days later, as Sarah prepared to leave the only home she had ever known, she held Samuel one last time. The baby looked up at her with dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. "I love you, my darling boy," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I hope someday you'll understand why I had to do this. I hope someday you'll forgive me." Jake stood in the doorway watching the heartbreaking scene. He had given Sarah enough money to start over in San Antonio, along with a letter of introduction to a family who could help her find work. "I promise you," Jake said quietly, "I'll love him like my own son. I'll protect him and guide him, and make sure he grows up to be a man you can be proud of." Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She handed Samuel to Jake, her arms feeling empty and cold without her child's warmth. That night, Sarah McKinnon disappeared from Redemption Valley, leaving behind only the memory of a young woman who had made the ultimate sacrifice for her child's future. And Jake Morrison, the corrupt sheriff who had lost his way, found himself holding a baby who would either redeem his soul or destroy what was left of his conscience. As he looked down at Samuel sleeping peacefully in his arms, Jake whispered a vow that would shape the next 16 years of their lives. "I'll make sure you never know the truth about where you came from, son. I'll make sure you never feel the shame your mother carried. You'll be a Morrison, and that name will mean something good because of you." The making of a man. 16 years had passed since that cold October night, and Samuel Morrison had grown into a strong, capable young man. At 16, he stood nearly 6 feet tall with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined jaw. He had his mother's quick intelligence and his father's stubborn streak, though he had no knowledge of Sarah's contribution to his character. The year was 1901, and Redemption Valley had grown from a small frontier town into a thriving community. The railroad had come through 5 years earlier, bringing prosperity and new challenges. Jake Morrison, now 58, had maintained his position as sheriff through a combination of political maneuvering and carefully managed corruption. To the outside world, he was a respected lawman, raising his son alone after the tragic death of his wife. Samuel had grown up believing the story Jake had crafted. He thought his mother had died giving birth to him, that she had been Jake's beloved wife who had passed away before he could really know her. Jake had even created a small grave in the town cemetery, marked with a simple headstone that read, "Margaret Morrison, beloved wife and mother." On this particular morning, Samuel was helping Jake clean the sheriff's office when Deputy Tom Bradley burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff Morrison, we got trouble down at the Patterson Ranch," Tom announced, his voice breathless from a hard ride. "Someone's been rustling cattle again and Old Man Patterson is demanding action." Jake looked up from the papers he was organizing, his jaw tightening. The Patterson family still held significant influence in the county, and Jake had learned to dance carefully around their demands. William Patterson, the man who had abandoned Sarah all those years ago, was now a prominent rancher and town councilman. He had married a banker's daughter from Dallas and had never faced any consequences for his actions. "How many head this time?" Jake asked, reaching for his gun belt. "Near 30 head of prime beef," Tom replied. "Patterson's offering a $500 reward for whoever brings in the rustlers." Samuel's eyes lit up at the mention of the reward. "Pa, let me come with you. I'm old enough to help with real law work." Jake shook his head firmly. "This is dangerous business, son. I need you to stay here and keep an eye on things in town." "But Pa, I've been practicing with my gun every day. I can outshoot half the men in this county, and you know it." Jake did know it. Samuel had natural talent with a firearm, and had been begging for months to be allowed to help with serious sheriff's work. But Jake had always refused, trying to protect the boy from the darker aspects of law enforcement. "The answer is no, Samuel," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of both a father and a lawman. "I won't have you in harm's way." After Jake and Tom left for the Patterson Ranch, Samuel found himself alone in the sheriff's office, frustrated and restless. He had always felt like Jake was holding him back, treating him like a child when he was clearly capable of more. As he swept the floor, he couldn't help but think about the other young men his age, who were already working alongside their fathers, learning trades and earning respect. Later that afternoon, Samuel was organizing the wanted posters when he came across a file that made him pause. It was marked McKinnon Sarah Missing Person 1885. Curious, he opened the file and found a photograph of a young woman with auburn hair and striking green eyes. She looked familiar somehow, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her. The report was brief. Sarah McKinnon, age 19, disappeared from Redemption Valley in October 1885. Last seen leaving her family home. No known destination. Case closed due to lack of evidence or witnesses. Samuel studied the photograph more closely. Something about the woman's eyes seemed familiar, though he couldn't understand why. According to the date, she had disappeared around the same time he was born. He made a mental note to ask Jake about it later. That evening, Jake returned from the Patterson Ranch looking tired and frustrated. The rustlers had left no clear trail, and Patterson had been his usual demanding self, making thinly veiled threats about Jake's job security if the thieves weren't caught soon. "How did it go, Pa?" Samuel asked as Jake hung up his gun belt. "About as well as expected," Jake replied, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "The Patterson family expects miracles, and they're not shy about letting me know when they're disappointed." Samuel hesitated, then pulled out the missing person file. "Pa, I found this old case while I was organizing the files. This woman, Sarah McKinnon, she disappeared right around the time I was born. Do you remember anything about her?" Jake's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the whiskey glass trembling slightly. He set the glass down carefully and looked at the photograph, his face carefully neutral. "I remember the case," Jake said slowly. "She was a young woman who got herself into trouble, if you know what I mean. Her family disowned her and she disappeared one night, probably went to the city to start over. She looks familiar somehow," Samuel said, studying the photo again. "I can't explain it, but there's something about her eyes." Jake's heart was pounding, but he kept his expression calm. "You might have seen her around town when you were very young. She worked in her father's store for a while." Samuel nodded, accepting the explanation. "What happened to her family?" "Thomas McKinnon sold his store and moved away a few years later. Couldn't stand the shame, I suppose. The mother died of a fever not long after the daughter disappeared." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Jake opened it to find William Patterson standing on the porch, his face red with anger. "Morrison, I want those rustlers found, and I want them found now," Patterson demanded, pushing past Jake into the house. "I'm losing money every day they're out there." Samuel watched the interaction with interest. He had never liked William Patterson, finding him arrogant and entitled. The man treated Jake with barely concealed contempt, despite depending on him to solve his problems. "I'm doing everything I can, Patterson," Jake said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "These things take time." "Time I don't have," Patterson snapped. "I've got investors coming in next week and I can't afford to look weak. If you can't handle the job, maybe it's time to find someone who can." Samuel stepped forward, his young face flushed with indignation. "My father's been keeping this county safe for 20 years. Maybe if you kept better watch on your own cattle, you wouldn't have this problem." Patterson turned his cold gaze on Samuel, his eyes narrowing. "And maybe if your father taught you some respect for your betters, you wouldn't be running your mouth." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake stepped between his son and Patterson, his hand resting on his gun. "I think you'd better leave, Patterson," Jake said quietly. "Before this conversation goes somewhere we'll all regret." Patterson glared at both of them, then stalked out of the house without another word. After he left, Jake turned to Samuel, his expression serious. "Son, I appreciate you standing up for me, but that man is dangerous. He's got money and influence, and he can make our lives very difficult if we cross him." Samuel's jaw was set in stubborn determination. "I don't care how much money he has, Pa. He had no right to talk to you like that." Jake looked at his son with a mixture of pride and worry. Samuel had grown into a young man with strong moral convictions, exactly the kind of person Jake had hoped he would become. But Jake also knew that those same convictions could lead to trouble in a world where money and power often trumped justice. "Sometimes, son, we have to choose our battles carefully," Jake said. "Fighting every wrong doesn't make you a hero. Sometimes it just makes you dead." As they prepared for bed that night, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that there were secrets in his father's past, things that Jake wasn't telling him. The photograph of Sarah McKinnon had stirred something in him, a sense of connection he couldn't explain. And the way Jake had reacted to seeing it, the careful way he had answered questions, suggested there was more to the story than he was letting on. For the first time in his life, Samuel found himself questioning whether his father was telling him the whole truth about their family's history. And once that seed of doubt was planted, it would continue to grow until it eventually demanded answers that Jake wasn't prepared to give. The unraveling truth. The summer of 1901 brought an unexpected visitor to Redemption Valley. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, now in her 60s but still sharp as a tack, had returned to town after 5 years of practicing medicine in San Antonio. She had come back to settle her late brother's estate and had decided to stay, much to the relief of the townspeople who had been without a proper doctor since her departure. Samuel was in the general store buying supplies when he overheard Mrs. Henderson, the town's biggest gossip, talking to the store clerk about Dr. Hayes's return. "I heard she's been working with unwed mothers in San Antonio," Mrs. Henderson whispered conspiratorially. "Running some kind of home for fallen women. Can you imagine? In my day, such women were sent away in shame, not coddled like babies." Samuel bristled at the woman's harsh words, but something about the conversation nagged at him. That evening, he found himself walking past Dr. Hayes's newly reopened clinic, wondering about the woman who had apparently devoted her life to helping people society had cast aside. The next morning, Samuel was surprised to find Dr. Hayes at the sheriff's office, deep in conversation with Jake. Both adults looked up when he entered, and Samuel noticed that his father seemed unusually tense. "Samuel," Dr. Hayes said, studying him with sharp eyes. "My goodness, you've grown into a fine young man. You look just like—" She paused, glancing at Jake. "You look very much like your father." There was something in her tone that made Samuel curious. "Thank you, ma'am. Pa's told me you helped deliver me when I was born." Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "Yes, I did. It was a difficult night, but worth it to see such a healthy baby brought into the world." After Dr. Hayes left, Samuel noticed that Jake seemed distracted and on edge. That afternoon, when they were working together to repair a broken fence behind the house, Samuel decided to ask about it. "Pa, is everything all right? You seem worried about something." Jake hammered a nail with more force than necessary. "Just thinking about old times, son. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you." That evening, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He had been thinking about the photograph of Sarah McKinnon, about the familiar feeling he had when looking at her eyes. On impulse, he decided to visit Dr. Hayes and ask her about the missing woman. Dr. Hayes's clinic was in a converted house on the quiet side of town. Samuel knocked on the door, and when she answered, he saw recognition and something else, perhaps sadness, flash across her features. "Samuel Morrison," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you to see me this evening?" "Dr. Hayes, I found an old missing person file at the sheriff's office. A woman named Sarah McKinnon who disappeared around the time I was born. Do you remember her?" Dr. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. "Why do you ask about her, Samuel?" "I don't know exactly. Something about her photograph seemed familiar, and I was wondering, was she one of the unwed mothers you helped? Is that why you remember her?" Dr. Hayes looked at Samuel with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Samuel, some questions are better left unasked. Some truths are too heavy for young shoulders to carry." "But I need to know," Samuel pressed. "I can't explain it, but I feel like this is important, like it's connected to me somehow." Dr. Hayes stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "Your father is a good man, Samuel. He's made mistakes, as we all have, but he loves you deeply. Sometimes love requires difficult choices." "What does that mean?" Samuel asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Dr. Hayes turned back to him, her expression grave. "It means that before you go looking for answers, you need to be prepared for the possibility that those answers might change everything you think you know about your life." Samuel left the clinic more confused than ever. Dr. Hayes's cryptic words only strengthened his suspicion that there was more to his family's story than Jake had told him. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. The next day, Samuel decided to take a different approach. He went to the town cemetery and found the grave that Jake had always told him was his mother's. "Margaret Morrison, beloved wife and mother," the headstone read. Samuel knelt beside the grave, studying the dates and the inscription. "Ma," he whispered, feeling foolish but needing to speak the words aloud. "I wish I knew more about you. I wish I knew what really happened. She was a remarkable woman," a voice said behind him. Samuel spun around to find William Patterson standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Patterson," Samuel said, getting to his feet. "I didn't hear you approach." Patterson walked closer, his eyes fixed on the headstone. "I knew your mother, Samuel. We were acquainted before she married your father." Samuel's heart began to race. "You knew her? What was she like?" Patterson was quiet for a moment, then said, "She was beautiful, kind. She had green eyes that seemed to see right through you." He paused, then added, "She deserved better than what life gave her." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. Patterson looked at him with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read. "Sometimes, son, the people we love make choices that hurt us. Your mother made a choice that hurt a lot of people, including herself." Before Samuel could ask what he meant, Patterson walked away, leaving him standing alone by the grave with more questions than ever. That evening, Samuel confronted Jake directly. "Pa, I need you to tell me the truth about my mother. I know there's more to the story than what you've told me." Jake looked up from his dinner, his face suddenly pale. "Son, I don't know what you mean." "William Patterson knew her," Samuel said. "He told me she had green eyes and that she made a choice that hurt people. And Dr. Hayes acts like she's hiding something every time I ask about the past." Jake set down his fork, his hands trembling slightly. "Samuel, some things are better left buried." "Not this," Samuel said firmly. "I'm 16 years old, Pa. I'm old enough to know the truth about where I came from." Jake was quiet for a long moment, then stood up and walked to the window. "The truth is complicated, son. The truth is that sometimes people do the best they can with impossible situations." "Then tell me," Samuel said. "Tell me what really happened." Jake turned back to his son, and for the first time Samuel saw his father as he really was. Not the strong, confident sheriff, but a man carrying the weight of years of secrets and lies. "All right," Jake said finally, "but once I tell you, there's no going back. Once you know, everything changes." Samuel nodded, his heart pounding. "I understand." Jake poured himself a glass of whiskey with shaking hands. "Your mother's name wasn't Margaret Morrison, son. It was Sarah McKinnon, and she didn't die in childbirth. She's still alive, living in San Antonio under a different name." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, his mind reeling. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that everything I told you about your birth was a lie," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that you're not my son by blood, and the woman I've been claiming was your mother never existed." Samuel stared at his father, the man who had raised him, loved him, taught him everything he knew about life and morality, and felt his entire world crumble around him. "Then who am I?" he asked, his voice breaking. "If you're not my father and Margaret Morrison never existed, then who am I?" Jake looked at the boy he had raised as his own son, the boy who had given his life meaning and purpose, and prepared to tell him the truth that would either bring them closer together or destroy their relationship forever. "You're Samuel McKinnon," Jake said, "and the story of how you came to be my son is one of the most complicated and heartbreaking tales you'll ever hear."